Chinese woman was hired just to clean the barn, until the widowed rancher found his newborn twins sleeping in her arms. The road to the Turner Ranch wound through a valley where the wind never seemed to rest. That late autumn afternoon, it carried the scent of dry hay and distant snow, whispering over the yellowed fields as though warning what lay ahead. A lone woman walked its length, her small frame bent beneath the weight of a burlap sack in a life that had known too much silence. Her name was Lien Mei, though no one in this country ever said it right. Each step left a faint print in the cold dust, soon blurred by wind. She had come from the mining camps far north, where her husband had been buried beneath rock and rumor. The townsfolk had sent her off with neither word nor kindness, saying a woman like her ought to return where she came from. But there was nowhere left. So she walked, following the drifting smoke of ranch chimneys until she saw one still burning through the wind. Turner's Ranch, a lonely shape against a bruised sky. By the time she reached the gate, her lips were cracked and her fingers stiff with cold. She paused, unsure if she should knock on the fence post or pray instead. Her breath rose like ghost steam. Behind the barn, a man's voice barked at the horses, deep and rough as the mountains themselves. She followed it, cautious as a shadow. Paul Turner was not what she expected. He was tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who seemed carved from weather itself. His shirt sleeves were rolled, revealing forearms the color of sun-baked clay. When he looked up, his eyes were pale and unreadable, like winter sky before snow. He didn't ask her name, only what she wanted. She tried to speak, but her English frayed under the cold. "Work," she managed, her voice quiet. "I clean." Washington cook. He studied her as one might study an unfamiliar animal, curious, wary, maybe even a little sorry. Then he turned toward the barn. "Barn's dirty. You clean that, maybe Ma'll give you bread." That was all. No welcome, no warmth. Yet something in his tone lacked cruelty. It was simply a man who had run out of softness. Inside the barn, the air was heavy with hay and old sweat. Dust floated in the lantern glow like 1,000 sleeping stars. Lien rolled her sleeves and began. Her hands, though numb, moved with memory, gathering, wiping, restoring order to what had long been forgotten. The quiet filled her, and for the first time in months, her heart didn't ache with noise. Outside, the sun slid behind the hills and frost crept along the windows. Through the boards she heard faint crying, 2 babies hungry or frightened. The sound struck her chest like a bell. Without thinking, she hummed softly, an old tune her mother once sang under moonlit rice fields. The melody curled through the cracks, delicate as breath. Slowly the crying stopped. Paul stood at the cabin doorway, frozen mid-step. He looked toward the barn, where her voice carried faintly through the wind. The twins, wrapped in blankets by the fire, had quieted for the first time all evening. He didn't know what to make of it. His late wife Ruth had died bringing them into the world, and since then the house had felt more grave than home. Now a stranger's hum soothed what nothing else could. He went out into the yard. The moon was a thin silver coin above the barn roof. Inside, through the half-open door, he saw her bent over a broom, hair damp against her temples, sleeves rolled past her elbows. The horses watched her with calm eyes. She worked as though this place had always been hers. "Ma," he called toward the cabin. "That woman's cleaning the barn." From the window, Martha Turner leaned out, her gray hair tied in a strict knot. "Then let her," she said. "Ain't nobody else gonna." He frowned. "You sure? Folks will talk. Folks always talk. They don't feed babies, though." That ended the matter. He turned back toward the barn, leaning on the doorway post. "Don't stay too late," he muttered, half to himself, half to her. She didn't look up, but he noticed the faint nod. Hours passed. The lantern light dimmed to amber. The air thickened with warmth and the sweet smell of hay. Lien's fingers were bleeding from splinters, but she worked on, grateful to be unseen. When she finally set the broom aside, her knees trembled. She found an old blanket near the stable and spread it for rest. For a while she just sat there, breathing in the quiet. Somewhere in the dark, a baby whimpered again, one small sound against the wide silence. She listened, then began to hum once more, softer now, a melody winding through her exhaustion. From the shadow outside, Paul lingered again, drawn by something he didn't wish to name. The way she sat there, surrounded by creatures calm under her voice, reminded him of peace he thought buried with Ruth. He wanted to ask her name properly this time, maybe even thank her, but the words felt too heavy in his throat. Instead, he turned away, telling himself it was nothing. Inside the cabin, Martha rocked one twin and sighed. "They like her voice," she murmured. "It's strange, Eli. Like they've been waiting for it." He said nothing. just stared out the window toward the barn, where a single light glowed like a soul refusing to go out. Later, when the wind picked up, he stepped out to douse the lantern. As he pushed the door open, he froze. The woman was asleep against a hay bale, her head resting near the small cradle he'd left for stray lambs. And inside that cradle, nestled beneath her arm, one of his twins slept soundly, tiny hand curled around her sleeve. The other lay in her lap, breathing soft against her chest. Both babies had slipped from their blankets somehow, drawn by warmth, by her song, by whatever stillness she carried. Paul's heart kicked hard against his ribs. The sight was too intimate, too impossible. 4 months he had lived half dead, raising the boys with his mother's help, never daring to touch the cradle longer than duty required. Now here they were, sleeping in a stranger's arms as though they had finally found home. He stood in the doorway for a long time, his breath clouding in the cold. The lantern flickered between them, painting gold along her hair, the twins, the rough boards of the barn. It felt like trespassing on something sacred. Martha's voice drifted from behind him. "What's wrong?" He didn't turn. "She's holding them." "The babies?" He nodded slowly. "Both." Martha's tone softened. "Then let her. Maybe God's just sent someone who ain't afraid to love what's left." Paul swallowed hard, unable to answer. The wind rushed through the doorway, stirring the blanket. One twin sighed, nestled closer to her chest. In that small, flickering moment, something cracked inside him. Not quite love, not yet forgiveness, but the faint beginning of both. And as he stepped back into the night, he didn't notice that Lien's eyes had opened, watching him go, her gaze calm and unreadable. The wind carried her whisper after him. Just one word he couldn't understand, spoken in a language he'd never heard, but it sounded a lot like hope. Morning crept over the valley slow and gold, brushing the frost from the fence rails and catching the breath of cattle like pale ribbons in the air. The barn smelled of damp hay and smoke when Lien May woke. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Her arms were empty, but she still felt the weight of the twins against her skin, the faint echo of their breaths. Then she saw them, back in their cradle by the house window, Paul standing over them, silent, as if afraid any sound would break the fragile peace. She rose quickly, embarrassed. The barn door creaked and the cold bit her cheeks. Paul turned as she stepped outside, his face unreadable. He looked between her and the babies, then back toward the barn. "You should have left them where they belong," he said, voice quiet, almost unsure. She bowed her head, unable to explain that she hadn't meant to fall asleep, that she hadn't meant to hold them at all. "They were cold," was all she whispered. He gave a short nod, neither angry nor forgiving, and walked away toward the fields, the frost crunching beneath his boots. Martha stood at the doorway, a shawl tight around her shoulders. "Coffee's on," she said, though not unkindly. Inside, the kitchen glowed with the smell of cornmeal and smoke. Lien sat near the fire, her hands around a tin cup. Martha poured her a small measure, watching her closely. "You got little ones?" she asked. Lien shook her head. "No. No family." Martha's gaze softened a fraction. "Well, them boys of his, they don't sleep that calm for nobody. You got a way about you, I'll give you that." By midday the wind had died. Lien worked along the fence, patching boards, sweeping the yard, washing milk tins. She moved quietly, grateful to have something to do. The ranch breathed like a living thing, creaking wood, clucking hens, the distant low of cattle. Now and then she caught sight of Paul, riding out along the ridge, his shadow long against the pale hills. He didn't speak to her, but he didn't send her away either, and that to her felt like grace. That afternoon, a thin wail carried from the cabin. One of the twins, restless again. Lien hesitated, then went to the window. The baby's face was red, small fists thrashing. No one else was near. The old woman had gone to fetch water, and Paul was still in the pasture. Lien stepped inside, heart tight, and lifted the child. The fever heat under his skin startled her. She pressed her wrist to his brow, then laid him against her chest. His breathing rasped like dry leaves. She scanned the shelves, no medicine, only a jar of salt and a few herbs. She thought of the plants near the barn wall, the ones she'd seen in the morning frost. Willow bark, mint, a few stalks of feverweed. She'd used them once before, long ago, when her sister's baby burned with sickness in the hills of Guangdong. Quickly she went out, gathered the leaves, ground them with a smooth stone, and mixed them in warm water from the stove. The smell of earth filled the room. She wiped the baby's brow with the mixture, whispering soft prayers under her breath. When Martha returned, she froze in the doorway. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" Lien stepped back, startled. "Fever," she stammered. "I help." The older woman's face hardened. You'll not put strange weeds on my daughter's child." She rushed forward, snatching the cloth from her hands. But the baby stirred, coughed once, then sighed, the redness fading from his cheeks. For a moment, all three froze in the stillness. Martha blinked, then slowly lowered her hands. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "Maybe you do know something." The door opened. Paul entered, smelling of earth and horse sweat. "What's happened?" he asked. Martha explained quickly, half defensive, half bewildered. He turned to Lien, eyes narrowing slightly. "You gave him medicine?" She met his gaze, steady now. "Herbs," she said. "From ground. Old ways." His mouth twitched, as if unsure whether to thank her or warn her. Finally he just said, "He's breathing better," and looked away. The days that followed passed in small, strange peace. Lien worked quietly, mending what was broken. Tools, fences, small hearts. The twins began to reach for her when she passed their cradle, their fingers grasping the edge of her skirt. She would smile faintly, hiding it behind her sleeve. At night, she sang in the barn again, her voice mixing with the low hum of wind and cattle. But word traveled fast in towns that had nothing better to do. At the trading post 2 miles down, tongues wagged about the China woman living under Turner's roof. Paul heard it one morning when he rode in for nails. "You feeding her or she feeding you?" someone called, and laughter followed. He didn't answer, but his jaw set hard. On the ride back the air felt heavier. That evening he found her by the well, sleeves rolled, washing the twins' blankets. "You shouldn't work after dark," he said. She didn't look up. "Night is quiet. No one shout." He frowned, unsure if she meant the wind or the townsfolk. "They don't know you," he said finally. "They don't have to." Her voice was soft but steady. "I know work. I know babies. That is enough." He studied her in the fading light. The lantern glow caught the curve of her cheek, the small scar near her jaw, the way her hands moved even when still. He felt a tightening in his chest that wasn't quite affection, not yet, but it wasn't indifference either. "You saved him," he said quietly. "The fevered one." She nodded once. "He saved me," she answered, and he didn't understand what she meant, but the words stayed with him long after he walked away. Later that night, Martha came to sit beside Lien at the fire. She held a mending needle and an old quilt. "When my Ruth was alive," she said softly, "this place used to sound different. Like laughter could still fit between walls." She threaded the needle, eyes glistening in the firelight. "Paul don't talk much since she died. Don't take it personal. He just forgot how." Lien kept her gaze on the flames. "Sometimes I forget too." Outside, wind rattled the shutters, but the warmth held. Lien's song rose again, low, patient, like prayer stitched into air. Martha listened, the needle pausing mid-seam. "Strange words," she whispered, "but somehow they sound like home." Hours later, Paul returned from checking the horses. Through the window he saw them, his mother nodding off in her chair, Lien still humming by the cradle. The twins slept deep, their breaths even. For the first time since Ruth's death, the house looked whole. He leaned his head against the doorframe, just breathing, afraid to disturb the fragile balance. When he finally stepped inside, Lien glanced up, startled. He held out the coat he'd worn all day, still warm from his body. "You should take this," he said. "Cold's coming." She hesitated, then took it, the rough wool heavy in her hands. Their fingers brushed, a small accidental touch, but it lingered longer than either expected. He turned to go, clearing his throat, pretending not to notice. But as he reached the door, she spoke softly, almost to herself. "Snow soon." He looked back, one hand on the latch. "How do you know?" She smiled faintly, eyes drifting to the sleeping children. "Air smells like goodbye." Her words followed him into the night, curling through the cold air like smoke. And for the first time in years, Paul Turner prayed the morning wouldn't come too soon. The storm came without warning, an angry wall of clouds rolling over the hills like a herd with no master. One moment the world was still, and the next it howled. Lien stood in the yard, hanging damp sheets on the line when the first crack of thunder split the sky. The air thickened, heavy and metallic. Chickens scattered, horses stamped. She gathered the sheets quickly, pressing them to her chest as the wind clawed her hair loose. From the ridge, Paul shouted something lost to the roar. She saw him riding hard, driving cattle toward the lower gate before the storm broke full. By the time she reached the barn, rain was falling sideways. She slammed the door against the gale and stood catching her breath. The animals shifted restlessly, eyes wide in the dim. She whispered to calm them, her voice thin against the storm's growl. Lightning flashed through the cracks, blue veins lighting the rafters. She grabbed a lantern, checked the roof seams, the stalls, the horses. Everything in her body moved by instinct, the kind of knowing born of survival. A cry rose through the thunder. At first she thought it was the wind, high, sharp, carried by distance. Then she froze. It came again. One of the twins. The sound drifted from the cabin. Her heart kicked hard. Martha was in town for salt and supplies, Paul still out on the ridge. She ran. The rain cut her vision to ribbons. Mud pulled at her boots, each step heavier than the last. When she burst into the cabin, the door slammed behind her with a force that shook the frame. Inside, one twin was crying from the cradle while the other had toppled onto the rug, tangled in a blanket, tiny mouth gasping for air. Panic pierced her chest. She scooped him up, patting his back until the air returned, her hands trembling. Lightning lit the room bright as day. She saw the fire had nearly gone out. Water leaked through the chimney seam, dripping onto the floor. She set the baby down gently, threw kindling into the hearth, coaxing flame back with shaking fingers. Smoke curled upward, carrying the smell of wet ash and fear. The thunder outside cracked so close that the windows rattled. She pressed both babies to her chest, humming through her teeth just to drown the sound. The door flew open again and Paul stumbled in, soaked to the bone. His hat was gone, his coat plastered with mud. He stopped cold at the sight before him. Lien kneeling by the fire, both boys wrapped against her body, her hair unbound and dripping down her back. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Then another flash lit her face, pale with worry but steady. What happened? His voice came rough, almost hoarse. Wind broke door. They cry. She stammered, holding one child tighter as thunder boomed again. He crossed the room in 2 strides, checking the window latch, the fire, the roof. The rain hit harder, pouring through the crack near the chimney. It's gonna flood if it keeps up, he muttered. She tried to stand, but her foot slipped on the wet floor. He caught her arm, and for a breath they were face to face, his hand still gripping hers, eyes reflecting the flicker of the fire. You're bleeding, he said, seeing the small cut along her palm. From wood, she whispered. He guided her toward the table, the baby still cradled in her arms. Sit, he ordered gently. When she hesitated, he pulled out the chair himself. Sit, he repeated, softer this time. She obeyed. He tore a strip from his own shirt, wrapping her hand carefully. His fingers were rough, but the touch held care. The baby's cries faded into hiccups, then quiet breaths. Outside, the storm hammered harder, rattling the world apart. They sat in silence, the kind that feels fragile and too alive to break. She watched him through the wavering lamplight. His jaw was tense, but there was something else beneath, the same sorrow she had glimpsed that first night in the barn. A man trapped inside his own stillness. When he finally spoke, it was low, almost ashamed. I don't remember the last time they stopped crying that easy. She looked down at the twins, now asleep, their tiny hands still clutching her dress. They know heart, she said quietly. Children always know heart. He studied her for a long moment. Then the fire sputtered, throwing sparks. He rose to add wood, his shadow tall against the wall. You shouldn't have come here, he murmured. These hills don't treat folks like you kindly. Lien's eyes lifted slowly. Nowhere treat me kindly, she replied, her accent softening the words. But here, I can breathe. He turned, the flicker of flame catching the lines in his face. Something shifted in his expression, a mixture of guilt and something close to admiration. You don't scare easy, he said. I scare, she corrected, eyes lowering. I just move anyway. The wind roared again, but it sounded different now, less like rage, more like release. Paul sat down across from her, elbows on his knees, watching the twins sleep. The warmth from the fire pressed against their silence, and for a while neither moved. Outside, rain hissed against the window panes like a whispering crowd. Hours passed. The storm began to drift east, leaving the air heavy and wet. Paul leaned back, rubbing his eyes. When Ruth was alive, he said, voice thick, she used to hum when storms came. Said it kept the dark from settling. Lien's gaze softened. Maybe she still hum, she said. Through wind. He looked up, surprised by the tenderness in her tone. It wasn't pity. It was knowing, the kind of knowing that comes from shared loss. She rose then, carrying one twin to the cradle, tucking him in carefully. The other she laid beside him, brushing their foreheads with a feather-light touch. Her hair, still damp, clung to her neck. The lantern glow traced her silhouette, small, worn, but unbreakable. When she turned, she found Paul watching. Their eyes met. In his, she saw something opening, a door long shut. He stood slowly, uncertain, almost shy. You should rest, he said. So should you, she replied, and for the first time, a faint smile ghosted her lips. He looked away, pretending to busy himself with the fire, but his hands trembled. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was full of questions neither dared voice, of things too delicate to name. Before dawn, the rain eased to a drizzle. He checked the door one last time and paused by her chair. She'd fallen asleep there, chin resting on her shoulder, the faintest peace on her face. The twins stirred beside her, sighing like the smallest echoes of contentment. Paul stared for a long time, caught between gratitude and fear. He reached down, gently lifted the blanket slipping from her shoulder, and drew it higher. Then, without meaning to, his fingers brushed a lock of her hair from her cheek. Her skin was warm. Human warmth. Honest warmth. It startled him. He stepped back quickly, heart pounding. Outside, the horizon lightened, pale and new. The first rays of dawn caught on the wet earth, turning every puddle into silver. He whispered something to himself, maybe a prayer, maybe a warning. And from where she slept, Lien stirred, eyes fluttering open just as he turned to leave. She saw his shadow vanish through the door, and for the first time she wasn't afraid of the emptiness he left behind. Because somewhere between thunder and dawn, she had heard something in his silence. A man beginning at last to feel again. The storm had left the valley bruised and quiet. 4 days afterward, a thin fog clung to the fields, soft as breath but heavy with the scent of earth and ash. The fences had fallen in places, and Paul mended them one by one, the hammer's rhythm echoing faintly through the gray. Inside the cabin, Lien tended to the twins and the barn with the same gentle precision she brought to everything she touched. But between them now hung a silence thick as smoke, neither cold nor cruel, just full of something unnamed, waiting to find its shape. Word of the woman on Turner's land reached town faster than sunlight over snow. The merchant's wife whispered it over flour bins. The preacher's boy carried it to the next ranch before supper. They said Paul Turner had gone mad with grief and taken in a foreign woman to replace what God had taken from him. Others said worse. When Paul rode in for feed, men stopped talking but didn't look away. It was the kind of silence that cut deeper than words. That evening he found a folded paper tacked to his gate. A summons, County Inspector, 3 days hence, to verify the lawful employment of one Chinese woman. He read it twice, jaw tightening. It wasn't about law. It was about shame. He crushed the paper in his fist and stared at the horizon until the wind carried the anger out of him. In the house, the twins giggled at the sound of Lien's voice. She knelt by the stove, showing them how to shape dough with tiny hands. Paul stood unseen in the doorway, the glow of the fire painting her face gold. There was nothing improper in it, no sin, no secret, but he knew what the town would make of such a sight. And yet he couldn't look away. She was no longer the silent figure who had arrived hungry and unsure. There was peace in her now, a quiet dignity that steadied the room. Martha entered behind him, carrying a basket of clean linens. She caught his stare and said softly, "You'll have to choose soon, Eli. What kind of man you mean to be?" He turned, startled. "What's that supposed to mean?" She set the basket down. "You can keep pretending she's just a worker, or you can stand for what she's done for this family. But don't leave her hanging between." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked out to the porch, letting the cold clear his thoughts. The sky was pale with coming snow, and from the barn came her voice again, humming the same low melody that had once quieted his sons. It drifted through the dusk like a prayer too gentle to die. That night, Lien sat by the window, writing something on a scrap of brown paper with a stub of pencil. Her hand moved slowly, the letters curling in her native script. When Martha asked what it was, she smiled faintly. "A letter," she said. "In case I go." "Go where?" Martha frowned. "Man from town comes soon," she murmured. "Maybe he say I must leave. I write for the boys, so they remember song." Martha felt the breath catch in her throat. "No one's sending you anywhere," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked at the younger woman, so small beside the window, the lamplight touching her silver hairpins. "I'll talk to Paul," she promised. When she told him later, he stared into the fire for a long while, jaw set, eyes distant. "If they take her, they'll take more than her," he said finally. "They'll take what little peace these boys have left." The next morning dawned white and hard. Snow had come in the night, clean and cruel. The inspector rode up just past noon, a thin man with a wool coat and a sharper smile. He dismounted stiffly, boots crunching on ice. "Mr. Turner," he said, tipping his hat without warmth, "I'm here on account of that woman you've got working your property." Paul stood tall, arms folded. She's done more honest work than most men in this county. The man sniffed. That may be, but there's talk. Folks wondering what arrangement you two have. Martha appeared in the doorway before Paul could speak. The arrangement is decent living and earned bread, she said sharply. You can tell your folks that. The inspector's smirk faltered, but he persisted. Still, laws are laws. Foreigners can't. Paul stepped forward, voice low but steady. She's not leaving. Something in his tone made the man blink. You willing to stand before the board for her, then? Paul's hand tightened around the porch rail. I already stand for her. The man hesitated, then muttered something about records, and turned back to his horse. His shadow shrank into the white as he rode away. When the sound of hooves faded, Paul exhaled, slow and shaky. He looked back toward the house. Leanne was standing inside, half hidden by the doorframe, her hands clasped together as if holding her own breath. He walked toward her. You heard? She nodded. I stay. His voice softened. You stay. Something trembled in her eyes, relief, disbelief, perhaps both. She turned away quickly, blinking fast. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall to his side. You don't owe me thanks, he said quietly. You've earned your place here. That evening, as twilight folded over the snow, the three of them sat near the hearth, Martha mending, Paul whittling, Leanne singing to the twins. The cabin felt different now, as if the walls themselves had remembered warmth. Outside, the wind rose but couldn't enter. When the boys finally slept, Leanne carried the lamp to the window. Snowflakes clung to the glass like small stars. She traced a circle in the frost, then turned to find Paul watching. Why you help me? She asked softly. He thought for a moment, then said, because someone should have helped sooner. And because when you sing, this house sounds like it used to. Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Instead, she took the folded paper from her pocket, the letter she'd written, and held it out to him. For you, she whispered. He unfolded it, staring at the lines of Chinese script. I can't read it, he said. You don't need to, she replied. It say thank you, and sorry. Sorry for what? She hesitated. For bringing trouble. He shook his head. You didn't bring it. You just made it worth facing. Their eyes met in the lamplight. No fire, no thunder, only the steady hum of something alive between them. Outside, the first star pierced the night. But before either could speak again, a distant shout broke through the stillness. Paul turned sharply. Down the slope, a glow flickered red against the snow, too bright for lantern light. The barn, Martha gasped. He was already moving, boots thudding across the floor. Leanne followed, heart hammering, as smoke began to rise beyond the fence line. And as the wind carried the first crack of fire through the frozen air, the letter slipped from his hand and landed in the snow, the ink bleeding into the white like a word the world wasn't meant to forget. The night burned red against the snow. Smoke rolled low across the yard, twisting through the bitter air. Paul ran first, barehanded, the cold biting at his lungs as he grabbed a bucket from the trough. Sparks leapt from the barn roof like fireflies gone mad. The horses screamed inside, their panic sharp as metal. Behind him, Leanne was already running, skirts wet and heavy, clutching one of the twins close while the other lay bundled in Martha's arms by the fence. The flames roared, alive, greedy. Stay back. Paul shouted, but she didn't listen. She slipped past him into the haze, vanishing into the smoke. He cursed and followed, heat punching against his face. The world shrank to orange light and the crack of timber. He could just make out her small figure near the stall, tugging at the rope that held the gate shut. The horses kicked and tossed their heads. One broke free, bolting past him into the snow. She coughed hard, then turned toward him. More water, she cried, voice barely carrying. He doused the walls again, smoke stinging his eyes, but it was useless. The roof groaned, blackened beams raining embers like stars. Then he saw it, the cradle. The twins' old one, where the lambs had been kept since the storm. Flames had caught the straw inside, and without thought, Leanne lunged forward, beating at it with her bare hands. Paul shouted her name and dove after her. Together they pulled the cradle clear, tossing it toward the open door. She stumbled, coughing violently, hair singed, palms blistered. He grabbed her wrist and dragged her into the open just as the roof collapsed behind them with a scream of fire. They fell into the snow, gasping. The night was full of light and ruin. The barn crackled, its shape collapsing in on itself. For a long moment, neither moved. Leanne's hair glowed faintly with ember dust, her skin smudged with soot, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Paul turned toward her, shaking his head. You could have been killed, he rasped. She looked up, eyes wet with smoke and something deeper. So could you? He almost laughed, one sharp breath that turned to a tremor. You should have run. Her voice was small but certain. And leave you alone again? Something inside him cracked wide open. All those months of silence, guilt, and grief poured out in that moment between them, wordless but heavy as snow. He pressed his palm to her cheek, feeling the tremor of her jaw beneath his touch. Her eyes softened, the same brown he'd once thought distant but now saw were full of life. Behind them, Martha clutched the twins, tears freezing on her lashes. She watched them through the firelight and whispered a prayer that sounded more like gratitude than fear. When the last of the roof fell, the barn became nothing but glowing skeletons. The night was still again except for the sound of their breathing. Paul stood, pulling Lien gently to her feet. Her knees wobbled and he caught her, his arms closing around her as naturally as breath. She trembled against his chest and for the first time he didn't pull away. I can build again, he murmured into her hair. But not alone. She lifted her face, studying him as if afraid he might vanish like smoke. You mean that? I do. His voice broke on the words. You saved everything that mattered. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Only a small, shaking nod. By dawn, the fire had burned itself to ash. The horizon blushed pale gold, and the air smelled of wet wood and beginnings. The neighbors came riding in, faces lined with shock, eyes darting from the ruined barn to the woman standing beside him. One man muttered something under his breath. Paul heard it, the old prejudice curling back like smoke. But this time he didn't lower his head. She stays, he said simply, voice carrying across the snow. She belongs here. No one argued. The quiet of conviction left no room. The neighbors turned away one by one, the sound of hooves fading into the hills. When they were gone, Lien bent to the twins, brushing soot from their cheeks. They safe, she whispered. That is enough. Martha smiled faintly, her old hands trembling as she reached to tuck a blanket around them. You've got more courage than half the men I've met, she said. And the good Lord knows this family needed you. Lien looked up, confused by the softness in the older woman's tone. Family? Martha nodded. That's what you are now. The words sank into the morning air, quiet but final. Paul stood behind her, eyes on the horizon, jaw set in that way he had when making promises. Then slowly he took Lien's burnt hand in his. She winced but didn't pull away. The wind carried the scent of smoke and snow, two things that didn't belong together but somehow endured side by side. I'll build it better, he said. Bigger. For the boys, for the horses, and for you. You don't have to, she whispered. He looked at her, the corners of his mouth softening. I want to. For a long while they stood in the stillness, the twins sleeping against her shoulder, the world washed clean. He didn't kiss her, didn't speak the word love. It was there already, in the way he steadied her, in the warmth of his hand, in the steadiness of a man who'd finally stopped running from his own heart. Weeks later, the barn rose again, stronger than before. The snow melted into rivers that carried soot away, leaving only earth and the faint promise of spring. The townsfolk passed by less often now, their curiosity fading like smoke after rain. Inside the cabin, laughter began to replace silence. The twins took their first steps on the wooden floor, one toddling straight into Lien's waiting arms while Paul watched, a smile breaking through the quiet of his face. That night, under a sky clear as glass, he walked with her to the rebuilt barn. The air smelled of pine and fresh timber. The horses shifted softly inside, calm again. He stopped by the door and turned to her. You once said the air smelled like goodbye, he murmured. What's it smell like now? She looked up at him, eyes shimmering in the lamplight. Home, she said. He reached out, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, and for the first time their foreheads touched. No grand confession, no vows, only the quiet certainty of two souls who had survived enough storms to understand peace when it came. Inside, the twins stirred, one letting out a sleepy sigh that made them both laugh softly. Snow began to fall again outside, thin and gentle, wrapping the world in white. Paul whispered against her temple, "Thank you for staying." Lien closed her eyes, resting her hand over his heart. "Thank you for seeing me." The wind rose, then faded into silence. And as dawn's first light brushed the world, the Turner Ranch stood whole again, not because the fences were fixed or the roof held, but because, for the first time, love had found its place within its walls.